Recording. So we had three breakout room inquiries on the table. First one being, what is the thesis of the reading or the address given by Malcolm X to the University of Ghana? Second one being, what did you think you know or knew about Malcolm X prior to reading this text? And then finally, how has what you thought you knew about Malcolm X been disturbed, problematized, or disrupted by your reading of his address to the University of Ghana? Who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms?
Can I ask a question real fast?
Mm-hmm.
So in some of the later paragraphs of his speech, he actually seems to kind of advocate for stronger government presence when I think talking about African democracies. And I know it's not necessarily true, but in light of him kind of being labeled anti-government and anti-American here, I actually thought it was interesting that he seemed to kind of want more direction over there.
So keep in mind, Lee, the context, spatial, right? So where he was located, giving that address, and then temporal, the time that he was giving the address. So I believe it's 1964, independent Ghana, okay? Ghana is the first country in Africa to earn their independence, I want to say in 1958. Under the direction of Kwame Nkrumah. You know, I could be wrong. That could be 61. So anyway, anywhere from 58 to 61, Ghana gains their independence. So when he's talking about the government, right, and what kind of brings him into this conversation around the government is the discourse around the role of government in education. And what he's saying is that, you know, I'm hearing the conversation that y'all having around how involved the government should be in education. And my stance on this is in an anti-colonial situation, right? Because what Ghana was able to do was overthrow the British colonial power to gain their independence. So they're a newly formed anti-colonial independent country, right? So what Malcolm is arguing for is in a situation like Ghana's, where you're newly found your independence and you're newly doing away with the institution of colonialism, the government should step into play. Specifically, this type of government, which is the Ghanaian government ran by Kwame Nkrumah, right? They should come in play and try to direct the education in a way that's anti-colonial, right? And then he says, once this anti-colonial education has been established, then the people themselves can determine how they want their education to manifest. So really, for Malcolm, the importance and the emphasis of the government, not the American government, not the global colonial government, right? But this independent government of independent Ghana, he does feel that they should have the ability to kind of dictate the education of the people until they're able to do away with all of the vestiges of colonialism. So this is why he's okay with government, not government as a whole with the letter capital G, right? But this specified type of government under the tutelage and direction of Kwame Nkrumah. Does that answer your question, Lee?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
It's a very good question, though. That lets me know you were doing a close read. Who would like to discuss what was talked about in their breakout rooms?
I can go.
Okay, thank you, Cole.
So the thesis was kind of like a total takedown of America at that time. I feel like talking about how, you know, America, we espouse this notion of we're the home of the free, and he's saying, but how is that, you know, that's so hypocritical to say when there's 22 million Black people that are still colonialized, he said. And then he talked about how the media portrays the African image in a negative light, so the African American see themselves in a lesser way. And then we talked about that, and then that we didn't know too much about Malcolm X compared to someone like Martin Luther King.
You know, not to take up too much time, but I think that's important little piece of information that Cole divvied out, in the sense that we didn't know too much about Malcolm X juxtaposed to what we know about Martin Luther King. And that should say something within itself about who and the work of Malcolm X. Who else would like to share what was discussed in your breakout rooms? Matthew, what was discussed in your group?
So I was actually in the same group as Cole.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I was actually in the same group as Cole. So like,
Okay.
we kind of discussed the same things. None of us really knew who race was. So we didn't really like greatly discuss on that topic. We kind of knew it, while they kind of knew more than me. Like they knew more, but we didn't all like how do you say it? Like learn a lot about him, like in school or just our own research. But from my thesis, what I got was that he shows that like there's two different types of Americans who live in America, like the ones who actually gain the equality and freedom that America says they provide, and others who don't like have access to that, you could say, because of culture and their background.
Yeah. I like that, Matthew. Thank you. So not only two different types of America, but I would also add two different types of American. And I think it's a very astute observation. Let's get one more comment about their breakout rooms and we'll move on.
I could go.
Okay, thank you, Ryan.
So yeah, me and my group, we talked about, so the thesis of this reading was about how America promotes freedom, but it's not true. It's more like, you know, not the American's dream, but more like America's nightmare.
Yeah.
And he didn't choose to be born in America. Like he was forced to be there pretty much because of slavery. And what we knew prior to the reading about Malcolm X was just that he's a civil rights movement leader.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's about it. That's all we talked about.
So let me ask you this, Ryan, or anyone's from Ryan's group. What did the reading, and I'll open this up to anyone. What did the reading teach you about Malcolm X that you did not know before? No one learned anything new about Malcolm?
Can I go? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Melanie. Mm-hmm.
I feel like Malcolm X like talks freely, like he doesn't care about people's opinion. Like he like straight out he says like everything, like how America is not the perfect place. You know, he goes through like the history behind America, enslavement, forcing Black people to be used as like, you know, for purpose, like yeah. But, like I feel like he speaks about like the truth behind America.
Yeah. I think that's a great segue to kind of lead into my notes, this idea of Malcolm speaking the truth. And when we get into Baldwin, I'll get into this a little bit more about this idea and this notion of pillars. But for Malcolm X, his pillar for me was truth, right? Like doing things that are really guided and directed by truth, and then not allowing fear to dictate his movements, right? So even though, and if you're familiar with the story, towards the end of his life, the death threats, the bombing of his home, right? Although these things were taking place, he still continued to do the work that he was tasked to do. So he wouldn't allow the fear of assassination to inhibit his ability to do his duty and the work that he was placed on this planet to do. So if y'all know about me, like one of probably my two favorite ancestors would be Kwame Ture, who we engaged last week, and then Malcolm X, who we're engaging this week. I'm a vast student of Malcolm, right? I can't even count how many times that I've read the autobiography. I can't count how many times that I've seen the movie. on my leisure, I would sometimes spend my time reading or watching Malcolm X interviews. So I'm very steeped in not only his life, but the work that his life produced. So to provide some context to the address that he gives to the University of Ghana, the address was given in 1964. At this time, Malcolm X has defected or split from the Nation of Islam. So the Nation of Islam was the organization that kind of gave him his foundation, that gave him his platform, that politicized him. Malcolm X is very interesting because he is an individual who was birthed in struggle, right? His father was a preacher and organizer for the Marcus Garvey UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, right? And you could kind of think about the Black liberation struggle as a bifurcation, right? And there's two separate tracks, if you will, that the Black liberation struggle takes. One of the tracks, it can be traced through going far back as Samuel Delaney, going far back as the likes of George Pattermore, but it would go through Marcus Garvey, right? And his idea for Black nationalism, for Black liberation, the cultivation of the red, black, and green flag, of a Pan-African type of flag, right? But through Garvey, you get Malcolm, and through Malcolm, you get the Black Panthers, right? So this is the line of thought, of Black radical thought that's traced through Malcolm X, that's traced through Marcus Garvey. On that other side, you have the likes of Booker T. Washington, you have the likes of, some can argue, depending on what time it is that you're looking at W.E.B. Du Bois, he could fall on this track because Du Bois is someone who kind of changes over time, right? You could also look at the likes of Martin Luther King, excuse me, to also fall on the opposite track, right? So these are the two schools of thought that are often pitted against one another, right? So again, Marcus Garvey is almost like an ideological grandfather of Malcolm X. Malcolm X's father was murdered in Omaha, Nebraska because of his teachings of the Garvey movement. In fact, he was bashed in the back of the head, laid out on the train tracks in Nebraska, and the train ran over him. And they said that it was a suicide. So Malcolm's mother was not able to earn the insurance policy that she had on her husband. And the hardship of being a single mother of, I believe, I want to say 7 to 8 children, it literally drove her insane, right? And in the autobiography, they talk about how the state came in and kind of divided the family up. Anyway, that's a whole tangent. But Malcolm has defected from the Nation of Islam because, one, he found that some of the things that the Nation of Islam said that they were about, they were not about. Some of the ability of the Nation of Islam to serve as a moral correction for the Black society, that began to be eroded because the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, was found to have birthed 9 illegitimate children with the secretaries that worked for him under the Nation of Islam, right? Under the Nation of Islam, this type of loose sexual activity is forbidden. So for Malcolm, this is a contradiction. How can you say that you're a moral leader, but you're not doing the things that a moral leader should do, which causes him to split, okay? So part of his split, he takes his pilgrimage to Mecca. While he is abroad, right, he visits Africa. Of course, Mecca is in Africa, but he works his way from the west portion of Africa to the eastern coast of Africa. While doing so, he stops in Nigeria, he stops in Ghana, and this is where he gives the address to the University of Ghana. Now, keep in mind the time that we're working through, 1964. At this time, and really even prior to this time, the United States was doing a very concerted effort to send Black folks to Africa to talk about how well the race relations were in Africa. Okay, so they would send individuals to come and talk about, well, you know, this race issues that you're hearing on the radio and on the news and that, it's not that bad, man. I'm a Black dude, I'm from America, and I'm telling you that it's cool, it's not that bad, right? So that bit of context is why Malcolm takes such the stance that he takes in his address, right? And he lets you know that this is gonna be an informal address because as a Black person in America, our relationship to America is informal, right? So just to show you how we're treated, I'm going to give this address an informal address, right? And as all of you pointed out, he deals with the hypocrisy of American democracy, right, or the lack thereof. He lets you know that I'm not speaking to you as an American, but as a victim of America, right? And he says, I'm not here to make America look bad, right? That's not my task. But what I am here to do is to tell you the truth about America. And if that in so facto makes America look bad, that's not on me, that's on America, right? So that kind of goes back to Melanie's notion of him being driven by the truth, right? I also found it very interesting how he talks about the integration of Africa, and he makes the claim that for those who are interested in integration here in America, you might want to go to Africa and you can see how that plays out. And then he kind of tells you how those who occupy white bodies in Africa view their presence in Africa, right? He says, you know, I guess he was riding on the plane in and he was conversing with this white dude. And he said that, you know, Africa, they don't know how to value their wealth. They only value their wealth in terms of gold and silver, right? But for us, for the white folks who come into Africa, excuse me, we're looking at the material resources of the country, and that's what we seek to extract, right? So this is what Malcolm, it's kind of a double move, right? He's saying like, yeah, we can go the integration route if you want for those in America, but pay attention to what's going on with this integration. They're letting us mix and mingle, but they're taking the natural resources, right? And I believe it was in this class where I mentioned that the biggest misstep in my estimation that the Black liberation movement made was to rest their hat, if you will, on integration, right? Because prior to integration, they had their own businesses, they had their own banks, they had their own schools, they were independent, operated, and owned, right? After integration, all those things went to the wayside and they chose to spend their money and their resources with American white society, right? So this is not only a critique of this idea of integration, he's pointing out to you how the resources of Africa are being usurped, right? He talks about Kwame Nkrumah and how one of the biggest things that Nkrumah is doing, not only for Ghana, but Africa, but African people as a whole, is restoring the image of African people, giving African people an image to be proud of that's juxtaposed to the trope or the simulacrum of Africanness that you see via the media, right? These savage, barbarian type of caricatures. Then I think is also an interesting claim made by Malcolm, right? He says, we who live in America, we judge Black men by the way that America treats them, right? So if America is very accommodating and showering these Black individuals with honors, awards, and things of that nature, I'm taught to be very suspicious of that individual, right? But in juxtaposition, if America is talking poorly about that person, if they seek to belittle or downplay their abilities, then for Malcolm, this is someone who I'm a little more willing to listen to, because obviously by the way that they're being treated by America, they may be more for the people, right? And I think that this is a theoretical frame of reference that still plays true to this day, right? I don't think that, so for example, look who's being celebrated in American society. Obama is one example, right? Great president. I would argue he's probably the best president America has had, right? But as a Black president, how has the material conditions of African people changed under his presidency? It hasn't, right? So to me, that's an example of someone who's widely celebrated in the American lexicon, right? But done very minimal, if nothing, for the community that produced him. And this is some of the argument that Malcolm's making. So this is going to get to Lee's question about the question of the government's role in education, and this notion that until this idea, this ideology of colonialism is eradicated, then this independent government of Ghana should still dictate how education should manifest itself within the confines of Ghana. He speaks of Kwame Nkrumah, excuse me. And if you think back to last week's reading, right? Kwame, right? The name that of the person who was giving the speech last week, Kwame, same first name. Kwame Nkrumah, right? So Stokely Carmichael, who we read last week, he changed his name to Kwame Ture to honor Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, and Sekou Touré, the president of Guinea, who worked in tandem to develop what's called the All African People's Revolutionary Party, that Kwame Ture would bring from the west coast of Africa to the United States, right? So this is a homage to Kwame Nkrumah and an homage to Sekou Touré. Stokely Carmichael changing his name to Kwame Ture. And so he says that, Malcolm says that Nkrumah is the most enlightened leader because not only was he able to liberate Ghana, right, and throw off the shackles of colonialism, but he spent time in America learning in the American institutions. I believe he got a degree from the University of Penn. And then he also went abroad to London, I believe, earned a degree there, right? So Malcolm is saying that he is the most enlightened leader because he knows how African people are treated here in America. He knows how African peoples are treated in London and Europe, and he knows how to liberate African people there on the continent of Africa, right? So he won't be fooled when America sends these what he calls puppet Negro leaders to Africa to give this message of that racism has been eradicated, right? Malcolm is attentive to the fact that because Nkrumah was in America, he won't be fooled by or duped by that. Okay, he makes the claim that America is a 21st century colony, right? And America is offering Black folks second-class citizenship, right? And then there's this little interesting exchange that he makes about the little Black gangs in Harlem going around killing white folks, if you will, and they're trying to position those gangs as anti-white. And Malcolm says, no, they're not anti-white. They're anti-oppression, right? They're anti the frustration that this system of oppression has dealt upon African people, and they're responding in kind the same way that America responded when they wanted to defect from their European ancestors and establish their new nation in the new world, right? So I'll put my notes on pause there, and we'll jump into our fishbowl. You could talk about my notes, you could talk about your journal, you could talk about the breakout room discussions, all that's on the table. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I'll go.
Okay, we got Lee. Anyone else? Michael?
I'll do the fishbowl too.
Okay, thank you, Michael, got you. Let's get one more.
I'll go.
Okay, cool, got you, thank you, man. All right, so whoever, we got Lee, Michael, Diaz, and Cole. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
I can start. Yeah, so I don't think I have something like really new to say or anything, but just kind of touching on what you said and the speech. I think his Malcolm X's last paragraph was yeah, he definitely has this way with words that just kind of gets the idea across in a way that everyone can understand. And he was kind of, I think they're talking about liberty or death. And he talked about this white priest that they ran over, and not to kind of focus on white contributions, but I felt that this kind of, reminded me of our last reading and how they singled out the two white men to be shot. And, it kind of got me thinking about, Peter Norman and, in the Olympics, that kind of famous picture. And then even in Palestine, that American woman, Rachel Corrie. And I guess I feel like Malcolm X was kind of saying, if people who look like them, he said that explicitly actually, are killed so brutally, and then going back to what you said about Malcolm X's father, then what chance do Black people kind of have, right? But to resort to maybe the only thing that might actually bring change. And And I mean, I don't want to take too much time, but I mean, I just feel like this discussion of violence is really interesting, especially how American people kind of conceive violence, you know, because this is possibly the most domestically and internationally the most violent country on the planet. But, you know, especially white Americans, I feel, just in general, like not everybody, but like the culture has a really strange or unique way psychologically of relating to violence. You know, and I feel like there was this kind of thing going, like if like everywhere from, you know, the outrage over the Oscars while other countries are being bombed to kind of to kind of like, you know, there was this thing going around in the past where people were outraged because they thought black Africans were killing white landowners. And I just feel like there's this way of like this kind of um, cognitive dissonance in the way that white Americans have to kind of perceive violence, like not only violence to do violence as furthers their interest, but they have to kind of perceive violence as being moral while getting it to do something that serves their interests.
Yeah. I don't want to take up too much time, but you bring up something, Lee. So for the second class I'm teaching after this one, we're also doing Malcolm X this week, and I'm having them watch videos and their interviews. And it's funny, Lee, because in the interview that I'm having them watch this week for class, Malcolm talks about exactly what you're saying. And he says that because of white folks' history with violence, they cannot take an objective view of other groups engaging in acts of violence, right? And this non-objective view of other groups' acts of violence is always going to keep them in a lack of understanding, right? And it's always going to allow them to not justify the violence of other groups. And what I'll post that interview to your to this class's Google Classroom sites. That way, if you have the time, you could watch that. But I think it's really interesting how Lee picks up on this cognitive dissonance, if you will, and he echoes Malcolm's sentiments precisely. Whoever's next is on you.
Well, one thing that you went over it, but what stood out to me most in the reading was when Malcolm talked about what was it? Let me find the paragraph. Sorry. He spoke about that those that were not born in the U.S. still beg and crawl just to get a drink of coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, he was talking about, like, you know, the inequality that's shown to immigrants, and you know, he also mentioned that those born under the Constitution are given freedom, justice, and equality, and he feels that that's not given the same to African Americans and others who come into America who weren't born in America. And it just it seems like they always find a way to oppress, you know, people of culture. And another thing that stood out was when he talked about how Africans measure if Western powers make the African Americans or Africans measure wealth in terms of gold and silver, then they would never measure the value of wealth that's in their soil, and that's just another form of oppression to keep them down. And it makes African countries believe that they need Western powers when it's really the other way around. So that really stood out to me. And then I kind of connected it to another reading I had, another PAS class that I'm taking. In the reading, it was a situation where this person was covered in coal, and he came out in public and they were going to stone him, and he was running for his life, telling them, "Don't stone me, don't stone me." And just that fear that he had really shows how Black people view themselves in America because of what white Americans force onto them. believe in.
So Michael, just to clarify, the person who was covered in coal, he was being attacked because of his dark complexion due to the coal. Is that what?
Yeah, yeah, he was running for his life in the middle of the streets, and I don't know. It kind of. I thought of that when I was reading this reading. You know.
Do me a favor, Michael. I want to go to coal, but I do want to discuss this notion of wealth and land as it pertains to African consciousness. So once coal's done, remind me to circle back to that if I forget. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was kind of wanting to talk about some of the same stuff that Lee was talking about, because I have a feeling the reason why we don't learn very much about Malcolm X is because of his his kind of like militancy. Like one of the quotes I had always associated with him was like, by any means necessary. And like in my high school, it said in the handbook that you weren't allowed to wear Malcolm X t-shirts at my school, which is crazy. But yeah, the idea that like in America, like nobody else gets to be violent except for America. You know, we get to overthrow, you know, democratically elected leaders in Latin America, in the Middle East, because they won't be like puppets so we can like exploit their resources. And that's what he talks about in Africa. And it's just like a joke whenever we criticize another country. Like we have no moral high ground to criticize like Russia. I mean, Russia, I don't think what they're doing is right, but for America to criticize what they're doing is a joke, because we've done far worse for, you know, hundreds of years. So that's kind of what I wanted to address, like this like ownership of violence that we get to have.
Yeah, I think that's very profound, Cole, and I think that's a great contemporary analysis, right? This is a great way to tie what Malcolm's talking about in 1964 to what's going on now, right? Because it's Russia, right? America's a little bit more circumvent about getting involved with the situation of Ukraine, but I guarantee you, let that be any other country besides maybe Russia and China, America would already been over there trying to spread their democracy, right?
Yeah.
So, spot on, Cole. So thank you for that. And this idea of the moral high ground is a misnomer. And for me, I always take this position, and Malcolm takes it often as well. It's like, you know, America is in no position to talk about morale or the lack of morale that exists within the African community, because by and large, you insinuated the lack of morale that is within these communities, and not only within the Black community, but globally, right? Also, what Cole is talking about, there's a really, really brilliant book, and I forget the name of the author, but the book is titled The Diary of an Economic Hitman, right? And this is someone who was hired as a mercenary by America to go into these Latin American countries, to go into these African countries and offer to them, we got this plan for you, right? We got this economic platform for you. You either take this plan or we're gonna engage in a coup d'etat and we'll kill you. And for those who took the plan, the regime went on without issue. But for those who chose not to take the economic plan, then the hitman would come in and make sure that this individual is eliminated. You could think about Patrice Lumumba. You could think about Omar Gaddafi. I could give you several names of people who chose not to take the American economic platform and were met with violent ends, right? I also want to kind of talk about this, both what Lee and Cole are talking about in this regards to violence. And Lee brought up Palestine, right? And Palestine is a very, very, very interesting meditation if you want to investigate violence, right? Because since I could remember, right? Since I could remember when they showed this tension between Palestine and Israel, right? The Palestinians are historically always throwing rocks, but the Israelis are armed with tanks, armed with bombs, armed with submachine guns, right? And rarely ever is the violence of Israel questioned juxtaposed to the violence of these Palestinians throwing rocks. So in other words, right, because of how violence has been capitalized by Western powers, it's more egregious for someone of culture to throw a rock at a tank than it is for that tank to bomb the city of the person of culture. Does that make sense? Are you gathering what I'm saying to you on how Western powers has capitalized this notion of violence and have made it to where anyone who tries to challenge their authority with means of force become delegitimized, right? Again, throwing a rock at a machine gun, throwing a rock at a tank, right, is positioned as more violent than the bombs that go off in civilian areas in Palestine, okay? And then this idea of wealth that Michael brings to our attention, and Malcolm doesn't really touch on this, but I want to kind of drop something on y'all as it pertains to that. The dude in conversation with Malcolm says, you know, Africans only value wealth based off gold and silver. They don't account for the wealth of the land, right? Let me ask y'all, how do you go about getting oil from land? How do you go about extracting minerals from the land? How do you go about extracting gold and silver from the land? What is the process of extracting those minerals? How do you do that?
Mining.
Mining, what did you say, Michael?
I was gonna say, isn't it drilled by those machines?
Drilling, yep. So excavating the land, right? Digging into the land. African people, from the indigenous context, even up until now, they view land very sacredly, right? So to go through the process of digging up the land and destroying the land for wealth is beyond the conception of African people, right? Just like indigenous people here in the Americas, they value the land differently. So to dig in the land and create mines in the land, it does not make sense because it's going to devalue this land that you honor, right? For by and large, African people, indigenous people, right? They view land as a living, breathing entity. Surprise, it is, right? Trees breathe, right? So because of them viewing this land as a living, breathing entity to be honored, you're debasing and defiling the land by digging it up for wealth. So it's not that they don't have the ability to see the value in their land. They truly value the land the way it should be valued, not just for this type of wealth, but allowing the land to be what it is for a natural state of being to manifest, right? Thinking back to how we start our semester and dealing with the teachings of Ptah-hotep to eliminate strife, right? But this is elimination of strife even from the standpoint of how we relate to nature. And that's the difference. It's not about them not knowing how to do these things. It's about them having a separate value system than the Western world that feels it's okay to destroy land to accumulate wealth, which is why we're in a climate crisis as we speak that the Western power does not want to capitulate to or even acknowledge, right? Okay, so I'm gonna put it into my conversation. I would like to hear from others about what they thought about the reading, what they thought about Malcolm, or any of what they think about violence, anything that was discussed today. I would like to hear from others. Excuse me. Go ahead, Michael.
All right, can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Solid. I wanted to talk about two things. So first off, I wanted to talk about the informality of the whole speech. I feel like we did talk about it earlier. Like, I like how the fact that it's supposed to be an address, right? Usually when you go to university, you would see like, oh, it's probably formal. Like we are talking about a serious subject. Yet Malcolm essentially like does it very informally. Like there, he says contractions or like things that you would expect in a normal conversation, you know? Like, and I like the fact that he was emphasizing, like it was kind of correlating with the relationship of Black people in America because you don't get that mutual respect right there. And essentially he's like, why should I give that same like effort in this speech? You know, that's what I wanted to say about that.
Yeah.
Secondly, I wanted to talk about the second question that we had today about like what we knew prior. It was kind of similar to like what Cole mentioned at first. Like me personally, I wasn't really taught that much about Malcolm X compared to like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and I feel like that kind of oh, sorry, give me 1 second. There was a quote that there was essentially talking about like the relating into contemporary work of how our education system now, like there could be a lot of, as long as people are knowledgeable of great figures like Malcolm X, like there could be a lot of potentially like microaggressions, how like that could be potentially like not as extreme once people are knowledgeable in that type of education, rather than like how currently we learn history through a white perspective, how we've talked about in prior weeks. I just found that pretty interesting.
Yeah. Now, you bring up a lot of good points. And I like your attentiveness to the informality of his address, because that speaks to, and I believe also Melanie was talking about this, it speaks to his method, right? Like there's a methodology of speech giving that Malcolm cultivated that was very effective, and it was very, to Melanie's point, universal, right? So mind you, he's flew across the country, sorry, not even across the country, he flew across the Atlantic to a whole nother continent, and he's able to give the same type of effective address with the barrier of language, right? And I think speaks to his ability to be universal and be relatable. So very, very good call out. Who else? Daniel Gomez, what did you think about the material for this week?
Hold on, my brothers are kind of going crazy. Hold on.
Go for it. While Daniel gets situated, JW, how about you? What did you think about the material for this week?
I really thought it was interesting, and I like the fact that it brought light to not necessarily like justify, I want to say justifying, but like showing that Malcolm X wasn't always just like, you know, the anti-white, just like anti-harmony that like the US has always kind of portrayed him as. And I think I really picked up on it when you said that like how America understands African Americans or perceives them is kind of how that community looks at them. So what I thought of is like if an African American is like successful and like being praised for that, a lot of them will see like, oh, he's out of touch. Oh, he doesn't understand what it's like to necessarily be African American, where this isn't the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so another thing I also liked was this, that I was thinking about, is that I feel like he was overlooked. Like Malcolm X was like overlooked in American history because of what he said. And by him truly speaking his mind and just saying, again, what really happened, and in truth, America saw that as, oh, he's challenging our authority and he's making us look bad. And so whereas Dr. King was more about like evolving and, you know, like working in harmony, like Malcolm, like he brought up the past. He said, you guys did this and you guys have to take accountability for this, and America didn't like that. So I feel like that's a reason why he was like kind of swept under the rug in kind of like the same way like Ida B. Wells was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good call out, JW. I think one thing is interesting about the distinction America often likes to draw between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And the distinction is almost positioning one as more responsible, if you will, more relatable, more valid, right? Being Martin Luther King, the other being more irresponsible, more irrational, more radical, right? But they both met the same fate. That was a bullet. They were assassinated, right? So to me, that shows for this power structure that we call the American government, or what's more specifically we could call COINTELPRO, at the hands of J. Edgar Hoover. It don't matter if you're violent or non-violent, they gonna kill your ass regardless, right? It's this idea, and there was a movie about this that came out maybe 2 or 3 summers ago dealing with Fred Hampton, the idea of eliminating the rise of the Black Messiah. And if you research the COINTELPRO papers, within those papers, J. Edgar Hoover literally writes that this is for the purpose of eliminating the rise of a Black Messiah. And a Messiah is just someone who can liberate, save the Black race, right? And this is why, whether it be as irresponsible and radical as Malcolm X was, or as responsible and non-radical as Martin Luther King was, they both met the same fate, right? In fact, the FBI's file on Martin Luther King was much larger than their file that they had on Malcolm X, and that within itself tells you something. Any other last minute comments, questions, or concerns? Okay. Let me show you all the readings for next week. Okay. So we've gotten through, yeah, we'll do Baldwin next, because I think Baldwin predates the Black Panther Party. But let me just bear with me 1 second. I want to see something. I just want to, yeah, okay. You know what? Nah, we're gonna read this next, because I think this kind of bleeds right into our conversation around violence and self-defense. This is Huey P Newton, Dr. Huey P Newton, because oftentimes they don't give him his credit as being a Ph.D. holder. This is his 2 speeches that he's delivering on this notion of self-defense. I will email this out to you all by Thursday or Friday, but if you want to access it now, I'm sorry, shit. If you want to access it now, it's here in weeks 9 through 12, the Huey P Newton reader. So this will be our next reading. And then after that, we'll go into some James Baldwin. But next will be Huey P Newton in defense of self-defense. Not too long. So make sure you read that, journal on that, and then be prepared to discuss that in class on Monday.